Trigger warning. This podcast contains discussion of emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, and includes explicit language. Listener and viewer discretion is advised.
You know, one of the things I think that was so radical about the Courage to Heal, among many other things, is that we told survivors they didn't have to forgive their perpetrators.
Without healing, traumatic experiences can have an enormous impact on defining who we are and who we will become.
Wade Robson and myself, James Safechuck, are both survivors of childhood abuse. In this podcast, we're talking with survivors, trauma specialists, and advocates,
highlighting the many resources available in order to inspire the brave steps to starting or continuing the healing journey.
This is From Trauma
to Triumph. Hey everyone, and welcome to our podcast, From Trauma to Triumph, with myself, Wade Robson, and James Safechuck. Today we have another amazing guest by the name of Laura Davis. Laura has written 7 nonfiction books that have changed people's lives. Notably, The Courage to Heal and Allies in Healing paved the way for hundreds of thousands of women, men, and their loved ones to heal from the trauma of sexual abuse. Laura also loves building communities of writers and teaches weekly writing workshops online and in Santa Cruz, California.
In the course of her long career as a communicator, Laura has worked as a columnist, talk show host, radio reporter, radio producer, blogger, editor, and speaker. In her latest book, The Burning Light of Two Stars, A Mother-Daughter Story, Laura tells the story of her tumultuous relationship with her mother from the time of her birth until her mother's death. It gives a no-holds-barred peek at the real woman behind the teacher, facilitator, and author.
So Laura, again, it's amazing to have you here. I'm going to really appreciate you taking the time to sit with us.
It's an honor to be with you. So, I've been looking forward to our conversation. I think we'll get into some really interesting territory.
So yeah, I guess we'll start with, in the late 80s, I think it was 88, you
Right.
co-authored this amazing book, The Courage to Heal, which, made a massive impact and contribution to the child abuse survivor community. And so I'm just curious if you can speak about what motivated you to write that book.
Driven is the word to write that book. And, I was sexually abused by my grandfather when I was a little girl, and I blocked it out like a lot of survivors do. And it was only about a year before we started writing The Courage to Heal that I had my first incest memories. And, for me, it came up in the context of my first really deeply in love relationship. I thought I was going to be with this woman for the rest of my life. We were planning our future. We were imagining ourselves like old ladies rocking on the porch, watching our grandchildren. And what happened really is, I think, a fairly typical scenario is that once intimacy and sexuality got put in the same vicinity, I shut down. So, I shut down. I didn't know why, but I would start dissociating. I didn't have a word for it then, but I would just go away is the way I looked at it.
And about how old were you?
I was 27 years old. And my partner at the time just, was patient for a while. And then, was also actually from a really abusive home. I didn't know it at the time. And she just started getting really angry. And one day she confronted me and she just screamed at me, "Where do you go?" And that was the moment that little, it's like those moments in life, there aren't that many of them. I could count them on one hand, where the truth, this little bubble of truth just came to the surface, and I just started crying in a way I never had before, because I was a pretty controlled, contained person. And I just said I was molested. And I just, as soon as I said it, I knew it was true. And then all these memories started breaking through about my grandfather, my mother's father, who had sexually abused me. And so that like catapulted me into what Ellen and I later called in the Courage to Heal the emergency stage, which is where my whole life was revolving around incest. I felt on one hand, it was almost like a vindication because so many things about my life that I had never understood, why I had so much trouble with intimacy, relationships, and just a lot of things about me suddenly made sense in this context. But I also felt broken and that I would never recover, and that I was damaged goods. That was the way I felt. And I was obsessed. I couldn't think of anything else. I got myself into therapy, luckily with a really good therapist right away. And my relationship ended. My girlfriend just couldn't handle it, broke up with me. I was certain I would never have another relationship.
What was that like when you told her you came out to somebody and then?
Well, it was horrible. I mean, I just, as I said, I just felt shattered by it. I felt broken. And I was really convinced that I was too damaged to ever have another relationship, and I was only 27 years old. So, so it was hard. And at the same time, I had been a writer, my whole life. And I had published, I'd been like a freelance feature article writer. I'd been a talk show host. I'd worked in radio. I'd done a lot of things with communications. And when I was 23 years old, I had first moved to Santa Cruz, where I still live. Mm-hmm. And that very weekend, I went to do some laundry. And on the laundromat wall, there was a bulletin board. And on this bulletin board was a poster. This is before the internet. And the poster said, "Writing About Our Lives with Ellen Bass." And it was an ad for her writing workshop, a women's writing workshop. And it was like 3 days after I moved to Santa Cruz. And it had those little things you tear off at the bottom.
Yeah.
I tore one of those little things. I called the phone number and I joined her group the next week. And so that's how I met Ellen Bass. She was my writing teacher.
How you guys met.
Yeah, she was my writing teacher, and I stayed in her group for a couple of years. And she was a mentor for me at that time, very influential. And after a couple of years, I quit her group, but we became friends after that. And right when I was about the time after I remembered the incest, I knew I needed to do something new in my career and my work life. So I set out to have a party, basically, where I invited people, and Ellen was one of those people, to help me brainstorm my next move. And I made a presentation. I had these flip charts about I don't want to work at a corporation. I don't want to have to dress up for work. I want to be casual. I don't really like having a boss. I don't want to deal with office politics. And I'm a communicator. And I just did this whole presentation, which proved my skills,
Right.
And I cooked a big meal for everybody. And then people sat around and I had them fill out a form, a questionnaire about me, and which all was kind of very funny when I think about it now. And Ellen was at that workshop, and she had just published with a group of survivors a book called "I Never Told Anyone," and it was I think it was published in like 1985 or 86. It was the very first book where women told their first person stories of having been sexually abused. I mean, it was like the very beginning of that kind of breaking silence, and that book was taking off and spreading. And her publisher, who at the time was Harper and Row, wanted her to write a sequel. And they wanted her to write a book about healing. Like, okay, now you've named the problem, what could be done about it? And so Ellen told me that at this party. And she said, but I'm not going to do it. And she said, I know how hard it is to write a book. And she had a 4-year-old daughter at the time, and a partner. And, she had a full-on business as a writing teacher. And I was like definitely the junior member of this partnership. She was 9 years older than me, which now is not very significant, but at the time was a lot. And I said, well, what if I write it with you? Would you say yes? And she was like, no. She said, if I was going to write it with anyone, Laura, it would be you, because I know you have the writing chops and you have the drive to make something like this happen. But I'm not going to do it. And I just kept working on her, over the next few months. I'd say, well, what if I do everything for the first year and then you join in? What if I do all the interviews? And finally, one day I got this little like a Hallmark card that had all these like little embossed balloons on the front. And I opened it up and it just said, yes. That's how that
awesome.
that's how the book started.
And sorry if I missed it, but how long after your moment of kind of revelation of the incest coming forward did that all occur?
Maybe like, I don't know, a year later, a year and a half later. I mean, not much. Like I said, I remembered at 27. We were writing the book. I was 28 years old, or 28, 29, right in there. It took us 28, I think, because it took us 3.5 years to finish it and get it published. And I was 31 when the book came out. And I was, while we were writing it, I definitely was the driver. I mean, I had this like intense, passionate need to do this. And I was kind of dragging Ellen along. I mean, she was very committed too, but my capacity for work was like ridiculously too much, anyway, but so, I don't know if that book ever would have happened if I hadn't had that kind of life force. And it always felt to us like kind of we were meant to do it. And I don't usually, that's not the way I frame my life is, being meant to do this or meant to do that, or I got a message, but it really felt that about this. Yeah. It felt like we were in the right place at the right time. And we were able to communicate about the healing process in a way that was simple, clear, inspiring, and gritty. We really told the truth. We did not. And it was not written in therapist. Neither of us are therapists. It wasn't written in like therapist language. It wasn't talking down to anyone. And we had I did tons of interviews, and we had lots of people telling their direct stories, which I think is really powerful. And when the book came out, I didn't expect anything really to happen, but within about 6 months, it just started to mushroom and grow. And it was just passed from survivor to survivor, and therapists were handing it out, buying it by the case for their clients. And it just created this groundswell and it really was, we were at the forefront of this movement, of empowerment for incest survivors. And, we were one part of many parts, but we were very visible because of the book.
Right. Right.
And just one more thing is that it put me in this kind of really weird position of becoming famous in this very little niche for like one of the very worst things that had ever happened to me. And that was at such a young age, it was a very difficult position to be put into, to be in. It was both rewarding, it was satisfying, and it was really disorienting.
Right. I bet.
So you're trying to heal at that. Right. You're still in your early process of healing. You're still like a survivor looking for answers, or like, just figuring yourself out. And then you're suddenly this voice for other survivors. Right. Did that trip up, or like, how did you navigate that?
I guess I felt really split, which is, how a lot of survivors feel anyway. And when I went on the lecture circuit, and, women would arrive by the busload to hear me speak. I mean, I would speak in these theaters, and there'd be like a line around the block of women coming, clutching their copies of The Courage to Heal just to hear me speak. And it would just be me in this auditorium with like a spotlight and a glass of water, and I when I would speak, I would feel like, again, this is one of those words I don't like to use, but I felt like I was channeling something, like there was something coming through me, and that I was really a vehicle or a vessel for this message. But it was beyond my own kind of, it was like my small self got out of the way, and like the more healed part of me was able to come forward and deliver this message in a way that really moved people. And then they would wait in line. There'd be like an hour or 2 hours of just waiting for people to get their books signed. And I would try to make eye contact. And sometimes I would hug every person in that line, and they would tell me a little bit of their story, and I would write them a personal message. And I would do that, for hours. But then at the end of the night, I would go to my hotel room, and I would just I would take the makeup off that I wore only on the stage, and I would take off my fancy clothes, and I would put on my flannel pajamas, and I would just feel like I was deflating almost into nothing.
Did you feel pressure? Did you ever feel pressure to be further along in
No,
Like, because you're representing other people. Did you feel any
No.
pressure like that to be further along in your healing?
no. And I don't think I ever pretended either. I didn't feel like I was pretending. It's just that I couldn't maintain that kind of clarity. I mean, I think sometimes in life there's like a part of us that is more healed or more capable, or it's like almost like it would be like I plugged into a socket.
Mhm.
And then when I unplugged, all the energy would go out of me. And then I would feel, because I was on the road, I would feel so isolated, and I was going through this period of feeling like I would never have another lover. I would never have a relationship. I had friends who I really loved and who cared about me. But I was also completely estranged from my family, my mother's side of the family at this point. From her point of view, I was spreading lies about my grandfather now on national TV,
Right.
and I wanted her to believe me, and she wanted me to recant. And so we had already had a pretty challenging, semi-estranged relationship, and this was like the final straw. So I felt this isolation.
Did you have a support group at that point? Who were you leaning toward on?
I had really fantastic friends. I had a
Mhm.
chosen family. I think a
Mhm.
lot of gay people do that. I mean, I had some people in my family. My parents were divorced. My father really supported me.
Mhm.
My brother, he kind of wanted to support me, but he always felt like he was in the middle, so I couldn't rely on him. But my father did support me. I had a couple cousins who were really supportive, but mostly I had a family of friends that I nurtured, and that people I'm still close to, decades later. So that's who I relied on. And I had a therapist.
Mhm.
I was in a incest survivors support group for part of that time.
Right.
But it was hard. And I think the other thing was that because people put me on a pedestal as this healed person, even I didn't claim that, but they would look up to me. That sometimes they just want to touch me,
Mhm.
or like, and the problem with that is that I felt objectified, and I had already been objectified by my grandfather. So in some ways it triggered.
Right.
So it was mixed, because I felt so honored by the trust of these mostly women, 95% women, maybe, and 5% men would come to these events. I felt incredibly honored to have contributed to their healing and to have made a contribution to the field. And to have been able to take my talents, as a writer, as a communicator, and use them in the service of healing. But I also felt just still really broken,
So-
and it really wasn't till I quit all of that, that I felt like I began to be able to integrate more, because I got to a point where, even though I was successful, this was like my success, my career was being an incest survivor. And I didn't want to be identified that way for the rest of my life. I thought, I don't want to go through my life that this is how people know me, and this is how I know myself.
Right away? Did that thought come right away?
No, it took some years.
It took a few years, yeah.
Yeah, it took some years, and it reminded me, there was a couple, two sisters that I interviewed for the Courage to Heal, and I'll never forget them. And they talked about, they had very extreme abuse, and they were very intense women. And they talked about that the healing process started to feel like this sweater that was too tight, and that they were chafing under it because it was just too small, but it was terrifying to take it off. And that would be a good description of how I felt. It was like this identity of being famous for being an incest survivor, and having I would lie about my profession. If I'd be on like an airplane or a bus or something, and people say, "What do you do?" I'd say, "I'm an accountant," because no one ever asks a follow-up question if you say you're an accountant. But if I said I'm a writer, then it would be like, "Well, what have you published?" And then it would be like, there it would be. And I would have people, follow me into the bathroom at the movie theater to tell me their story. And, for a while, it was like empowering for me. And I felt honored to listen, but then it just became overwhelming. And I realized there were other parts of my life I wanted to develop, and that this healing process that I had written about was actually starting to work for me, and that I was starting to expand my field of possibilities besides just healing from sexual abuse. At 27, if you said, "Who are you?" I would have said, "I'm an incest survivor." That would have been like, I wouldn't have had anything else to say,
Right.
And now, if you said, "Who are you?" I would say, I'm an author, I'm a workshop leader, I'm a business owner, I'm a spouse, I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm a hiker, I'm a swimmer, I'm a mahjong player, I'm a cook.
Right.
I would not even put incest survivor on the list.
So
And
this-
it's not that I'm not, it's just not,
Yeah.
it's like, it's part of the fabric of what shaped me, but it's really in the background, way, way in the background.
Right.
I mean, I wonder if, like, when you first come out, like, it's a huge part of my life, and I think that's maybe that's the arc, is to, like, it needs to be a huge part of your life at first so that you can deal with it. Because I just wonder if it, like, for many people, just has to be, they're consumed by it for a period of time.
I think most people are. I don't know if everybody is, but I think most people are, because it influences every aspect of our lives, and reclaiming our power, our efficacy, our bodies, our sensuality, our sexuality. It's like each one of those areas requires so much work. And I think you're right. When you're silenced, the first thing is you have to, one of the chapters of The Courage to Heal is breaking silence. It's like you have to be able to say, "This happened to me." And you have to say it to yourself first. And then you need at least one other trusting, safe person that you could say that to. And I think, for many survivors, becoming an activist and advocacy is a big part of their healing process, because it's a way to channel that rage. It's a way to take back power. It's a way to feel powerful because you're doing something to stop it, or to raise awareness. And for some people, they continue that for decades. For me, it was, this is just my trajectory. I'm not saying it would be the same for either one of you, but for me, I needed to step away from it. And I wrote 4 books about healing from sexual abuse. I mean, it's not like
well, that's what I was going to ask, like, when it came to the subsequent books, and as far as this questioning of identity, how that timing wise played out.
Yeah, I wrote a workbook, the Courage to Heal workbook, that, kind of was a companion to the Courage to Heal. Ellen and I wrote a book called Beginning to Heal, which was basically a very little, easy to read version, for people either with English as a second language or lower literacy. And then I wrote a book for spouses called Partners, Allies and Healing for Partners of, and that was all within, 5 years.
Okay.
And then it was like, I really didn't, and the problem is, especially like in publishing and probably in a lot of things, certainly for musicians, like if you are really well known for something, and, I was making my publishing company money by writing these books, they want you to keep doing it.
Yeah. Do it again.
They just want you to keep doing the same thing. And it was like, I didn't want to do the same thing anymore, and I also wanted to have a family, and I had gotten to the point of feeling no longer like I was so damaged it wasn't possible. And, I, right about the time I was coming out of doing this, I met Karen, who is my spouse, who I've been with for over 30 years.
Wow.
She had an 11-year-old son who became my stepson. And then I had 2 more, I gave birth to 2 more kids. So we had 3 kids together. And I really got into that. That's what I wanted, to live a life. I didn't just want to. Anyway, so that was the choice I made. I could have kept going in that trajectory of like huge public life. I could have just gotten bigger and bigger. I have colleagues who started about the same time I did, and they just kept building a bigger and bigger platform. I just didn't make that choice. And I wanted to write about other things.
You bring up your journey into parenthood, with your personal experience of abuse from your grandfather, and then which we'll talk about more in a moment, your complicated relationship with your mother, and then playing, becoming identified for a period of time with this role of a teacher of sorts, or an author in this field as a survivor, and then becoming a parent, which is challenging enough as it is, right? We've all had experience with that here. But then do you feel that, due to your particular story and past and as a survivor and your relationship with your mother, that you had kind of particular challenges or triggers that came up once you started entering that journey of parenthood?
I actually was more afraid of what would happen than what actually happened. Like before, I was worried that I would abuse my kids. I was worried that at least that impulse would come up because it's what had happened to me. And it didn't. I was fortunate. And for some survivors, it does. But I was really worried about that. And I mean, I was in therapy and I knew that if anything came up, I would deal with it. I wasn't going to go unconscious about it, but I was worried about it. And I was worried about what would happen when my kids were the age I was when the abuse started, which was 3, because that's often a trigger for parents. Yeah. And, but I think because I brought awareness to it and I already had a really strong support system, and Karen was an amazing co-parent and partner. And she already had raised, her son he was 15 when Eli was born, and he was 19 when our youngest daughter was born, who's now 25 years old. So, she was a very seasoned parent, and she had also grown up in in a really abusive home. And she had to do a lot of healing to be a good parent herself already. So I felt like I could lean on her, which I did. Right. But also I found that there were, in my home growing up, I was sexually abused, and there were a lot of things my mother did that I felt invasive, psychically or emotionally invasive. But there was a lot of really good things in my childhood too. So, I mean, I grew up with both wonderful qualities in my parents and in my home, and deficits. Right. So I think because there was good, I also carried that good, and I had those really positive impulses. I think the thing that I chose, for one, I was always really so careful about teaching my children about their bodily autonomy, from the time they were really little, but naming the parts of their body and not touching them without their permission, and not like tickling them or roughhousing with them, and always looking for the signals and asking, is this okay? I mean, I just steeped them in that. And the other thing was that with my mother, and some of it I'd say was her, and some of it was really her generation was so emotionally not literate. And, I wasn't allowed to have feelings as a child unless I was happy. Right. There was absolutely no room for anger. There was no space for sadness. There was just no space for any kind of emotions. And I was really determined that my children would be emotionally literate, and so I taught them from the time they were little that they had a right to their feelings. If my son was having a tantrum, I didn't punish him for it. I might isolate him, or I might take him in another room, but I would witness his feelings until they spent themselves, and I really taught them to identify and articulate what they were feeling. And I think the other thing that was really important to me, and this isn't really about incest, it's more about my mother, is that I didn't want to feel like I was trying to control their lives. Like I wanted them to have autonomy. So I really fostered not just me, we fostered their independence, and I didn't have an agenda of what their life was going to turn out to be. I gave them lots of opportunities. If they were interested in something, I would support those interests, which is something my parents did as well. But there wasn't that feeling. I always felt like my mother owned me. And I really did not want to do that to my kids. And, they're all adults now. They're all independent. They're healthy. They're all in good relationships, and none of them had childhood trauma. Right. So, and some of that is luck, obviously. But some of it was also, I feel really happy about that for them. They're not having to rebuild their self to have a self, like all of us here. Yeah. So that feels really, really good, especially because they're already grown, and it's like they're baked, and they're good people, and they've got, their core is solid, and some of that, like I said, some of that was luck, some of it was intentional parenting.
Right.
Some of it is privilege also, obviously.
Right. When you mentioned your childhood and there, you being able to see that there was obviously bad things, horrible things that occurred, and then there was some good as well. Was that like for myself, once I first disclosed and began the journey consciously of healing from the sexual abuse, what happened for me was that kind of I painted everything black, right, in my past, in my childhood. And it was a process that's still ongoing of decoupling those things and being able to decipher between what was bad and what was good, and they can be independent of each other. So was that a journey for you as well to kind of pull those things apart? Or
I think I started out by idealizing my family for many years about what a great family I had. They were so wonderful. So for me, it was much more difficult to acknowledge the difficult, the bad, the abuse. That was much harder. And I think it was always harder for me to own and claim that aspect, because I was the only person in my family who ever acknowledged it. I mean, my grandfather was 70 when he molested me, and none of the other children, girls, women, ever acknowledged that it happened to them. And the odds that he just molested me are pretty thin, but I was the only one to come forward. I think it has taken me, I think of it more in terms of my mother, absolutely, because she was, in my mind, I described her, she was like a spider luring me into her web to devour me. That's how I felt. And she was definitely the antagonist in my life. And I really saw her as this kind of all-powerful ogre. And so with her, it took many, many decades to begin to kind of unravel the complexity of who she was and also her good qualities, and to see her much more as a full human being, not just as my nemesis. So I think that has taken decades for me to get there. And that's what I wrote about in the memoir, Burning Light of Two Stars, is our relationship, because it was so complicated and it took so long. And I was invested in seeing her in a particular way. And they always talk about in psychology, there's a negativity bias. And I think it was really true with her, that I really fixated on her flaws, her failures, and her betrayals. And the positive things about her, I just let them kind of drift away, and didn't really acknowledge them. And, now she's dead. She's been dead for 7 years. I see things from such a vaster, different, more complicated perspective, and also seeing the complexity of her life, like this man who sexually abused me was her father. She grew up poor in a tenement in New York City. She felt a lot of shame for the poverty she grew up in, and her parents were immigrants. And just the era of being a girl, and, she was the only person in her family who went to college, and she fought to go to college, free college in New York City. And I admire her a lot, but I mean, for many years, it was just like, Argh.
In the book, The Burning Light of Two Stars, you watch that transition happen, and part of it happens when you start finding these old letters. Once you read these letters, you start saying that there's a difference between how you had viewed her when you were younger, and you have a new perspective on her that goes along with you having this newfound relationship with her as well.
Yeah, I think, I think every memoir has the protagonist, who is, the author, me in this case. There's some underlying question or questions that the author is trying to sort out in the process of writing about their life. And a memoir is not like your whole life. It's a strand of your life, or often it's a limited time. And I knew that I wanted to write this memoir about this relationship with my mother, and that the core story would begin when she's 80 years old. She calls me on the phone. She's living in New Jersey. I'm living in California. And she announces that she is going to move across the country to live in my town for the rest of her life. So that's called the inciting incident that kicks the whole story into motion. And it really ends with her death. And one of the questions I was asking is, can you become a caregiver to someone who betrayed you in the past?
Mm.
That was one question. And the other is, was I capable of opening my heart to a greater extent than I ever had, despite this betrayal in our past?
Yeah.
And, I feel like it was the right time for me to write this story and publish it because of the incredible amount of animosity people are feeling in families towards each other, and all the schisms and all the hatred and all the, I'm on this side of the vaccine debate, I'm on this side,
Right.
I'm on this side. There's so much estrangement in families. And I think this story is about what would be considered a really intractable, impossible rift between two people, which is pretty extreme. I said I was sexually abused and she said I wasn't. It's hard to get more extreme than that. And yet we found a way to, I don't even know if heal is the right word, because the solution is very complicated. This is not like a Hallmark card ending, a happy ending with the violins. But we found a way to reconcile, to find our way back into relationship. And I did end up taking care of her at the end of her life, which is, if you had said to me at 27,
Right.
that I would ever do that, I would have looked at you like you were like completely insane. So I think what I've learned is that you don't really know what the outcome is going to be, even in these incredibly difficult, complicated relationships. And I want to stress, because I know there's a lot of survivors watching this, a lot of people with trauma and, really extreme things that have happened, or maybe not so extreme, but that the path I took is not for everyone. It was the right thing for me to do. It was my path. It was my path with my mother. And there are many situations where the best thing to do is to set a boundary, and not have a relationship with that person, because you never want to sacrifice your psychic or emotional well-being for someone else, because, you're being pressured to forgive, or you're feeling that pressure on the inside. I think when there is abuse in a family, the kind of the normal expectations, like that children should take care of their parents, that just gets dissolved. It's like, it's broken. It's broken by the abuser, and you don't owe that person anyone. For me, this was a choice I made, a very complicated choice that led me to becoming a much more open-hearted person, and I had to confront a lot of things about myself. I needed a ton of support to do it. And the mother I took care of at the end was definitely not the same person. She had dementia. I mean, she was not the same person who had been so incredibly difficult for me for so long. It's complicated. The whole thing was very complicated.
When you first decided to take care of your mother, was there any underlying motivation? Like, what did you think when you started with it? Were you what result were you expecting?
One of the very opening scenes in the book is she calls me. I've just had cancer, breast cancer. I'm 50 years old. And I just have come in from the backyard where I burned the notebook from the Stanford Cancer Center. It's like, I'm done with this chapter of my life. And I said, I'm open to whatever comes next, and basically wanting this calm, non-dramatic period of time that I could recover from having had cancer. Yeah. And that day my mother calls and announces she's moving to California. And, I had mixed feelings, I guess, to answer your question. Part of me was like, no, I can't do this. This is going to destroy my life. It's going to completely upset my equilibrium. I had 2 teenage kids at home at that point. And I just, I felt like the reason we had reconciled at all was because there was a 3,000-mile buffer between us. And I felt like if she came to my town and I lost that buffer, I would lose it. Like I would not be able
pressure
to
cooker.
Be in this pressure cooker. So I felt incredible anxiety, and I just freaked out about it. And yet there was definitely a part of me that wondered, was it possible for us to heal this relationship the rest of the way? So there was still this there was like a hopeful longing, and those two parts of me were like at war, and the whole time she was here, those two parts were functioning. The part that was like freaking out, and also her, when someone has dementia, their behavior, especially in the early stages, is, she was irrational, she was anxious, she was volatile, she was emotionally unpredictable. She was she was gaslighting me all the time. It was all the things I had with her when I was young that had been so difficult. And so it triggered, even though we had gotten to a better place over a period of decades, it triggered all those old feelings from when I was in my late 20s and early 30s. And I had to get my ass into therapy. I needed help sorting out the difference between the past and the present.
What did reconciling end up looking like in comparison to maybe what you thought it was going to look like?
I didn't really have an expectation. I think,
Okay.
well, can I read something to you?
Sure.
You were asking me about kind of the mixed feelings I had when she came. And I want to read you something from The Burning Light of Two Stars. I went to see her one day, and I was being what I would call like a good daughter. I was going through the motions of doing all the things she needed. I was a resource person. I would come fix her computer. I would take her to the doctor. I supervised her medicines. I was doing all the things I should do, but absolutely from a place with a very closed heart. Like I was still very protected. And one day I went over and was helping her with a bunch of things. And I didn't also was really repelled by her physically. Like I didn't want to touch her. And I went over, she was, having a really hard time. And I went over and I gave her a hug, and she kind of threw my arms away and she goes, "You're faking it," and she was right. I was faking it. I was forcing myself to do what I thought I should do. And I left that day and I wrote this. And this is pretty much what motivated me to keep going as her caretaker. 3 decades earlier, I had erected an impenetrable wall between us, a fortress with narrow slits so I could watch her approach. I ensured that my defenses were prepared anytime she came near me. I always had an escape plan. It's true, we later reconciled, and the fact that we were able to create a functional relationship was a miracle. But it wasn't an intimate miracle, because I never took down my wall. Oh, I taught myself to be kind to her in a fake it till you make it sort of way. But I still held her at bay. My wall just got subtler. It wasn't permeable. It was hard and opaque, and there was no door. We only met in the antechamber, the common room where guests are received. Only my polished self was on display, my masked self, and only in the antechamber. Mom never saw my inner sanctum, and I never saw hers. I got as close as I could within the constraints I had established, but closed is closed, and a closed heart is a lonely one. The price I paid to keep my mother out, at first with withdrawal, later with an armed fortress, and finally with the polite rules of détente, was love. The pure, unfettered love I longed for, the pure, unfettered love she craved. That day in her kitchen when I couldn't comfort her, I had to face it. My mother was still a stranger to me. With tentacles of need I was loath to touch. I wanted to be more than kind, to do more than merely what was right. I wanted to love my mother just once, freely and with the relief of a lost, exhausted child, beyond words and beyond all pretense. I wanted to lay my head on a place that was safe, just once, before it was too late.
Wow. Powerful.
So yeah, that's part of what was going on, was that longing, and was it an impossible child's longing, or was there some potential for some kind of connection of the heart that we had never achieved in all those, in 5 decades at that point?
Right. I relate so much to, I mean, many things, but in that writing that you just shared, no matter the complications and the pain and the stress and the trauma that had gone on in the relationship with your mother, still just how strong that desire is or can be, to feel that love, right? To feel that gentleness, to feel that connection. I remember early on, it's a very different story with my mother and I, but going into the therapist's office, just sitting on the couch and saying, I wish I could cut the umbilical cord.
Right.
Right. Like just no
Right.
matter what, like I wish I
Right.
could just say, you know what, I don't care anymore. Right.
Right.
But the bond just still so strong. That desire.
That reminds me when I was like 28, like at the peak of my hatred of my mother, I created this divorce ritual. It was on Mother's Day. Or soon, it was like the first Mother's Day I hadn't contacted my mother. I really thought God would strike me dead, or she would, it was just like such a taboo. And then I invited some friends over and, had these like proclamations I made, both like releasing her from my life and releasing myself into my own life. And I had this incredible childhood photo of the two of us like spooning together on a raft, kind of half in a lake. This really cute picture. We're both like this. I'm like 8 or 9 years old. And I took that photo and I cut the two of us apart, and then I burned it. I mean, I did this whole ritual. There were music and I had friends and, it really didn't work. I really wanted it to work, but the truth is it didn't work. And I think, I feel like my relationship with my mother, my book starts with my birth, and I feel like it started there and it ended. I don't even think it ended with her death, but I mean, that was a 57-year span, and it went through so many changes. And also, the mother I had at the end of her life was not the mother I had before. She in her dementia, she turned really sweet. I didn't think that would happen. I expected that she would turn into like the worst bitch and that she would be just horrible. Like all her rage and all her stuff would just get worse and worse and worse, and that she would be impossible. But what actually happened is when her ego structure, broke down because of having dementia, this sweet, loving person was there. And I would walk into her apartment. She was in assisted living at that point, and she would just say, Lori, you're the best daughter in the whole world. And then she'd say, you and Karen have done such a great job with those kids. Who says lesbians shouldn't have children? She was so sweet, and it was like, I had wanted that my whole life, that kind of just outpouring of love. But who was she? So it was very bittersweet. Very bittersweet. But it's like it took her having dementia for me to feel like it was safe to love her.
Do you think that like sweet person has always been buried in there?
Yeah, I do. I think it was always there.
It's sweet to think that, right? Because you're like, her defenses were up. You talked about in the book, you talk about your mom sort of liking to live in this fantasy world. She always she liked the fantasy, and I think that even went to her intimate relationships with other people as well. You think that sort of need to live in that fantasy was blocking her from even, accepting that her father abused you as well?
I don't know if it was, I think there's a lot of things, people always say, well, did he abuse her? It's like, well, I could make that, it's very easy to make that assumption, but I feel like, she never came to that on her own. But what I realized over if you read the book, you'll see she tried. She actually tried to believe me. She got like as close as she could, and then she just was not capable. And that pissed me off for so many years. And I think now looking back, I feel like she gave me the strength and the courage to face the abuse, but she didn't have it herself. Like she was able to, it's like she pushed me over the finish line almost, even though she couldn't acknowledge it. She raised a daughter. Some of it was her, some of it was my father, some of it was the times and the empowerment of women. And, you know, you could talk about, you know, the rape crisis movement. I mean, you could talk about so many things that made the empowerment of women and being able to speak out about sexual abuse possible. It's not just in my family, but in a way, I feel like she pushed me over a finish line that she couldn't do herself. And it took me many years to see her that way. I was always in my family. I have always been the one who speaks out, you know, and it's just who I am. You know, it's like who I'm meant to be. And it's created a lot of grief for people in my family. And I think some people respect me for it. Some people don't speak to me because of it. And, you know, this book, I hadn't published anything in 19 years. The book I wrote before the memoir was a book about reconciliation called I Thought We'd Never Speak Again. And after that, I didn't publish anything for almost 2 decades. And part of it was I had begun working my way back into my family with most of my relatives in a pretty superficial way, but I liked it. I liked that feeling of having made peace. I didn't need anything from them. I didn't need validation anymore. I had never backed down, but I also, it wasn't what my life was focused on. And and then when I started working on this book, I knew I had to tell the story, but I told myself it was just for me and I wasn't going to publish it because I was just terrified. I just didn't want to go through that again. I didn't want to go through losing my whole family all over again, you know? But I finally got to the point of realizing I just needed to publish it. I needed I got to a point, it took me 10 years, but like the 9th year, it was the year I said, okay, I really do want to publish this. This is a story that it's not just my story. It's a story that will speak to many people who are dealing with estranged relationships. And also, you know, for people who are survivors of sexual abuse, like, what does it look like after you've been healing for 35 years? You know, it's like when you're in the midst of it, like the people we wrote The Courage to Heal for, which is like for the white heat of the healing process, I think giving them an idea of like, yeah, you can have a successful relationship. I have raised healthy children. You know, it's not that there's no lasting impact, because I think things that are that devastating, you don't get over 100%. But I felt like I wanted to explore some of these aspects of healing that come way, way, way down the line. I mean, when I talk about reconciliation, you know, first of all, it's not for everyone. It's not appropriate, but even thinking about it is definitely not an early stage of the healing process, even though everyone is going to urge you to forgive and forget and let bygones be bygones. And this happened a long time ago, Laura. Why do you keep dwelling in the past? And I needed to do every bit of raging and grieving and speaking out and being an activist. And I mean, I needed to do all those things before I could even ever come around to considering the kind of complexity of what I entered into.
Yeah.
And I think that's important for people to know. It's not essential and it's not early. You know, there's so many other aspects of healing that are much more compelling and necessary just for our survival.
You brought up forgiveness, as far as that often people can, you know, early on try to urge a survivor or towards that as soon as possible, forgive and forget. You know, when you speak about this reconciliation with your mother, is forgiveness a part of that or no? Or
you know, forgiveness is so complicated. It's just so complex. And I've written about it a lot. And I think, you know, the only thing that I think is really true about forgiveness is we have to forgive ourselves, you know, for any responsibility we carry for the abuse. Like, you know, we wanted it, we got some secondary gain from it. We wanted to be close. We wanted to be affectionate. We, you know, asked for the candy, or we took the candy, or, you know, just all the reasons that children, or, you know, I was a teenager. It kept going when I was a teenager, you know, I got drunk at the party. I mean, you know, whatever. the most essential and the only essential forgiveness is for ourselves. So I want to start there. And it takes a long time to get there for many of us. And in terms of forgiving, the perpetrator, or forgiving, in this case, my mother, who was, I wouldn't call a perpetrator. She was I don't know, I don't want to label her, but I think it's an inside job. I think people have really different beliefs about it. And I don't think there is a right belief system about it. I do believe, from my experience, it was not something that I ever strove to achieve. It wasn't like, and I don't see it as like the pinnacle of healing is forgiveness. You climb up the healing mountain and at the top is forgiveness. And a lot of people describe it that way, and I don't see it that way. My experience, I have forgiven my mother and I have forgiven my grandfather. And in both instances, to me, it was a byproduct of my own healing process. Like, it just was something that naturally arose as a feeling inside of me. And it felt great. It feels wonderful to feel that feeling of, it's like this openness inside, this feeling of being magnanimous and compassionate. But it wasn't a goal of mine, and it wasn't something I made happen. It happened because I committed myself to all the other stages of healing. And so I guess that's what I want to say about it. I'm thinking about this this woman I interviewed for the book I Thought We'd Never Speak Again. And she was sexually abused by her parents, very violent people. And then they sexually abused her children because, like many survivors, she thought, oh, they just were into me. They would never hurt their grandchildren, which is a terrible mistake that many people make. So she didn't have anything to do with them. For many years, she went on with her life. She got help for her kids. She got help for herself. And many years later, she found out they were dying. And she had to think about what she wanted to do. And she decided she didn't want to go see them, but that she really prayed and she meditated and she went to therapy. And she said she really, at that point, her life was good and her kids were good. And so she wasn't, anymore dealing with kind of the intensity of the implications of what they had done in the same way she had been earlier. And she said that she really thought about the horror of their lives, like what had happened to them that had made them such kind of evil people and so broken and devastated. And she said she was able to send, basically from afar, loving kindness energy towards them, and really wishing them the best and the best death. And she said that felt really liberating for her. It didn't change her stance. She didn't go see them. She didn't take care of them. She didn't interact with them. But she was able to, it was like an inside experience for her. So another person I interviewed said that they closed the door to the relationship with a parent also. And they said, I closed the door, but I left the porch light on. And I just love that idea. When you're estranged from someone, sometimes we need to just, set a boundary that protects us. But like in my experience with my mother, you really, until both people are dead, you don't absolutely know the end of the story, and I like that idea of the porch light on because you're protecting yourself, you're going on with your life, but there's that little candle of possibility and you're not invested in it.
Right.
You're not putting your hopes in it. You're not longing for it.
Right. You're not sitting on the porch every night.
No, you're not sitting on the porch.
Right.
But the light is on. And, and for some people, they're going to turn the light off and that's perfectly fine, But I think it's, one of the things I think that was so radical about the Courage to Heal, among many other things, is that we told survivors they didn't have to forgive their perpetrators, that you don't owe your perpetrator anything, even if they apologize, even if they're one of the rare people who does the work and works the steps and, apologizes, you still don't even have to accept that apology. Right. It's really, you get to make your own choices and you don't owe that person anything.
Right.
Right.
So that's what
you-
I want to say about forgiveness, is that it feels, I love forgiveness. I love being a more forgiving person. And I think because of those experiences, I am a more forgiving person. I used to be much more rigid in my expectations of people, not just like abusers, but just my spouse, my friends, like my expectations of like, if you wronged me, I would hold on to it, and I've become much softer, through all of this. And I'm glad, it's like, it's about time.
Right.
Is a part of the forgiveness like having some compassion, I guess, for where your abuser came from? I'm just trying to figure out how you forgive your abuser. I don't like it.
Well, I wouldn't waste any time thinking about it.
Okay,
that's the first thing I would say. No, but I'll answer your question. But I'm talking to you directly, because you're saying you're like curious about it. I don't think you have to think about it. I would just put it out of your mind. And, yes, I think, understanding people are shaped by so many things. And I think there's been so much research about the epigenetics of trauma and how trauma is passed down through generations. And, and so I think when I think about my mother, I think about all of those things. And, I'm of a Jewish background, and the incredible trauma of pogroms and the Holocaust, and the ways that trauma just gets passed down and then repeated when it isn't healed. So yeah, I feel compassion for a lot of people, and there's some people I'll probably never feel compassion for. I don't think that's the goal, at least not for me. The goal is healing myself, and then these things may arise or may not. And, it feels great, and I have done meditation practice focused on compassion. I mean, not particularly for my abuser or like the worst person in the world, but just, on a daily basis, and for people I don't know, because I think our world is desperately in need of more compassion and loving kindness. I mean, look where we are, where our whole world is acting out abuse, right?
Right.
Yeah.
It seems like from the short amount of time we've known each other, and what you've been sharing, that over time you have seemingly, and tell me if you feel this is right, leaned more and more into, in relation to the healing journey, subtlety, nuance, and letting go of any sort of more and more rigid ideas as to what the checking particular boxes or what healing needs to look like, or that sort of thing. Does that sound right?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's nuanced, and it's also more complicated. Like there's more, I think when I started, my thinking was extremely black and white, and I'm sure some people listening to me today are like, Laura Davis is telling us we have to forgive, which of course is not what I'm saying. But I mean, when people think in black and white, then, maybe I'm on this side of the line because I'm suggesting the possibility, by sharing my experience that sometimes what we think is one way is not that way. And so, yeah, I think it's allowing, it's not being a black and white thinker, and it's not right. It's not like healing is not check, 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 because every situation we're in life, these issues come up again and again. I mean, that's the thing. We talked in the Courage to Heal, we presented it as a spiral, the healing process, and that you go through these things in cycles, and then you go through, a new developmental stage, like becoming a parent, or your kid is the age you were when you were abused, or, like I'm at the age and the stage where, I'm heading in the decline of my life. My life is not going up anymore. Maybe I'm at a plateau right now, but I mean, and as people age and they start losing some of their capacities, that can bring up the same kind of vulnerability they felt as a child, because they're more dependent, and that could bring up, so there's so many, people retire. There's so many life changes or grief, you're devastated by a loss, and that loss triggers all the other losses that you've ever experienced, and all these issues come up again. But I do experience that they come up differently and in more subtle ways. And, my resources are so much faster than they were when I was in my 20s,
Right.
and I know how to handle these things. And I have people I could reach out to. I have inner resources. I have outer resources. I have the confidence of having been healing for decades enables me to have faith that I can get through hard things.
Right.
Whereas before I thought they would just break me. So, and some of that is the healing process, and some of it is just maturity. I think as we get older, we've been through more, we've gotten through more.
If I got here, I can get there.
Right. If I got here, I can get there. Yeah.
What role do you think creativity, if it has played in your healing journey?
I think it's been really huge.
Yeah.
One of the most positive aspects of my childhood is my mother was an actor. So I grew up going to the theater all the time and playing in costume closets and climbing on catwalks and setting lights. My father was a music teacher. So there was like a baby grand piano in our living room with like all these instruments underneath. And he had a recorder ensemble group that would meet in our house, like, I don't know, every month or something. And he was an artist. There was tons of art. So there was, lots of storytelling. There was so much support for creativity. That was like really the focal point of our house. And so, yeah, creativity, being able to express myself.
Yeah.
I think has been really, really important, and for me, my most important channel is writing. And I find writing to be incredibly healing. I used it when I was first dealing with the sexual abuse. I filled dozens of notebooks. I mean, I haven't gone back and read those notebooks. I don't think I want to, but, I just wrote my way through it, and so, and also, creativity enables us to envision a future we haven't achieved yet. And so I've done so many things with my writing. I'm thinking of this one exercise where Dina Metzger wrote a book called Writing About Our Lives, Dina Metzger's book on writing. She's only written one. And she's a shaman and a poet and just an amazing woman. And she had an exercise where she has you go back and tell the story of your childhood, but you insert, I don't remember exactly, I don't remember how she expressed it. What I did is I added a guardian angel. And for me, the guardian angel I was an identical twin. And I was a preemie. I was born very premature, really shocking that at the year I was born that I lived, I was 2 pounds, 12 ounces. And at that time, babies that size did not live, but I did. But I had an identical twin sister who died. And my mother named her. She only lived 24 hours and named her Vicky, which I was very grateful that she had a name. And when I did this exercise, I did it as if Vicky was alive. And she was like, and I rewrote my whole childhood history with her in it. And no one could see her but me. I mean, she was like, she was invisible, but I could see her. And it was what would have happened if she had been there. Right. And it changed the whole trajectory of my childhood to have not been alone and with everything that happened. And I feel like that kind of writing exercise, I did that for months. It was like something I worked on for a long time. I feel like it changed me on a cellular level. And I think that writing has that power. I mean, that's why I love teaching writing retreats, where the focus is healing. I teach every year I teach an annual retreat on writing as a pathway through grief, loss, uncertainty, and change. And people have really transformative experiences in that week of writing, because there's something about being able to put ourselves on the page, tell the truth, and have it be witnessed. That is incredibly powerful. So I think for me, creativity has been essential. I've done a lot of collaging. I mean, I'm more capable as a writer. That's my talent. But I've used other kinds of creative means too. As a tool for healing. I think that's been really, for me, more important than a lot of talk therapy. I've done that. And I've done a lot of body work and body related therapy, some plant medicine. I mean, I've used a lot of different things to help me heal. And just talking, I think because I'm such a mental person, I always felt like I could like talk circles around the therapist. And so things that get me right into my body and my feelings have been much more effective.
Reminds me of like a lot of my personal therapeutic work so far has been focused around a lot of EMDR work and somatic experiencing. And at least in my experience of that, some of what have been some of the most impactful healing experiences for me have been my imagination, being able to reimagine traumatic experiences in which I receive what I needed at the time and didn't get, right? The safety or the protection. And so I can resonate with how powerful that is to have the power, whether it's writing or it's imagining or it's art or whatever it may be, to give yourself what you need, what someone else wasn't able to provide for you at the time.
Yeah. Or not even something coming to you, but from like rewriting that scene with you being empowered.
Yeah.
Where you react differently, and you're able to fight back, or you're able to get help, or you're able to. I think there's one other thing that I wanted to say, and that is,
please.
Because it's for me, it's wonderful to talk to the two of you, because you're being activists in the way that I was in the past, and I'm not anymore. I still certainly support a lot of survivors, come through my workshops and classes, and I think my writing is helpful, but I'm not directly involved the way I was before. And I feel like it's like passing the torch to the next generation. And that, I feel like empowered survivors can do so much to change this world. And that our world needs it so much. And that, I think as survivors heal, I remember we wrote about this in The Courage to Heal, that as survivors heal, all the energy that it's taken just to cope and survive, and being dissociated or being drunk or being, all the things we do to cope that shut down our life force. When that life force is freed, so much incredible energy and potential is freed. And so I think the healing of survivors is not just for survivors, but the world needs us, because those of us who have experienced abuse, know the power of freedom and healing. And also, I think, have a sense of justice. And the world needs people who have that deep sense of commitment and justice right now, more than ever.
Wow. Thank you for that.
So true. Yeah. Thank you. That's beautiful.
Laura, thank you so much for all of the work you've done for survivors, for people of all kinds, with your beautiful writing for humanity. When I first expressly began my healing journey, the first book my therapist recommended for me was a particular book for male survivors. And then I believe it was the next session that I came to, and I brought up, talking to my wife about this and already, some other survivors that I had come into contact with, and females, and, Courage to Heal was the first book he recommended to me then. So so you were right there at the beginning of my expressed journey, so it's also really amazing so it's a decade later now for me to be here with you. So I just want to express my gratitude for all of your work and the life you have lived and are living, and the way you're expressing and contributing to humanity, and for spending this time with James and I and all of us that are listening today. It's a privilege.
Yeah, so much gratitude. Thank you so much.
I feel the same. I feel honored to be a part of this, and it's actually nice to reflect through this interview just on the legacy of my life and what I've created, and just to reflect more just on my own healing process and how much it has changed over all these decades. And I'm so grateful that you are doing what you're doing, and that you're rallying. I'll say one more thing. I remember Ellen and I have had this. Ellen and I are still really good friends, and we live in the same town. And when we were writing The Courage to Heal, we were so naive. We believed if we just tell people about this, it will stop. If we just tell people, that'll be it.
Right.
And of course, that's not true. And in a way, it's really sad to have generation after generation after generation need the courage to heal. That it's still, we kept updating it, of course, but it's just that it's still needed. Like we thought it would become obsolete, and that now you're supporting a whole different generation of people who, unfortunately, this is the thing they have in common, is that they were violated.
Right. It's like absolutely, unfortunately, and then at the same time, fortunately, that we have each other. Right.
Yeah, we do.
So where can people find you and, read more about you, find your work? Where should people go?
Really, the best place is my website, lauradavis.net. You can read there the first 5 chapters of The Burning Light of Two Stars. It's posted on my website. There's a page that's called interviews, and there's like tons of podcasts and interviews like this, and workshops, and just all kinds of things of, me talking about a lot of different topics, actually, from everything from aging and dementia to reconciliation to sexual abuse to all these different things. So you could go there. Right. And then if you either are a writer or would like to be able to learn about using writing as a tool for your own healing, I have weekly writing classes. I have workshops that I teach, annually. I take people. I'm taking a group to Tuscany. I do all kinds of things with writing. Helping people, supporting people, and all the information about that is there. You can get on my mailing list, and you'll be notified when I have new things. I like to do different new things all the time. So I hope to get to know some of you in person. And the memoir is The Burning Light of Two Stars. It just won an award. There's something called the Book Life Prize, and it's by Publishers Weekly, and it just won an award for the best memoir, independently published memoir of 2021.
Wow.
So that was really cool.
That's great.
Congratulations. Well, thank you so much, Laura.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Hope to talk to you again soon.
This is From Trauma
to Triumph.